Gentlemen, can everyone hear us? Excellent, thank you very much. Welcome to this afternoon's event at Pulse Exchange. It's good to see friendly faces and not too many unfriendly ones as we sit here. Today's panel is a conversation about alignment and disalignment on China policy with at least three regional perspectives, and perhaps we can bring in more on that. We have guests online as well. To introduce myself, I'm John Bew. I was a foreign policy advisor in Number 10 for 5.5 years, and I'm a professor in the War Studies Department and a senior fellow at Policy Exchange and the Hoover Institution. And I will chair today's event, but not offer too many thoughts on the policy myself, because we have with us a number of experts and deeply politically involved people on the panel. I'm starting with my former colleague from government, Neil O'Brien, returning as former DEAR leader at Policy Exchange, had a number of government roles as a senior position in the shadow cabinet, a founder of the Conservative China Research Group in Parliament, and also has addressed the China question from a number of angles, not simply in the classical foreign policy domain in relation to industrial strategy, technological strategy as well. So thank you and welcome, Neil. Abigaël Vasselier, who was a formerly Deputy Director of China Policy in the European External Action Service, so the foreign policy wing of the Commission, and then holds a current position at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, which is one of Europe's only China-dedicated research units. And then my old friend Matt Turpin, former director on the NSC in the Trump administration, number 1, and then has subsequently moved to Palantir Technologies, which has some key figures who are at least adjacent to or close to the current Trump administration as well. And Matt, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, since we'd like to take our cue from America. And let me set a scene and ask you to assess where that scene is now. So thinking back to last year's G7, the one before during the UK general election campaign in Puglia in Italy, where of course Ukraine was very high on the agenda. President Joe Biden was there, hosted by Giorgia Meloni, and in that G7 summit, insofar as China was discussed, it followed a pattern of at least the previous 3 or 4 annual G7 summits, whereby you would have had, in terms of the language used in the communique, in terms of concrete policy propositions, whether it be talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan's strategic language for the Indo-Pacific, through to conversations on export controls and economic security domestically, Chinese investment in critical national infrastructure, supply chain dependency. Basically a shared language about the China challenge that probably started at Carbis Bay, with the first time China was mentioned in the G7 summit, moving through to that period of time. So a sense, if not unanimity, a sense at least in terms of the strategic approach to China, involving a significant degree of alignment among at least G7 partners. You could add to that also how China and the China challenge was posed in the NATO strategic concept and that broader group of nations. Where is that alignment now? And as a second part of that question, where and how should we begin to think about the second Trump administration's approach to China?
Well, first, thanks, John, for hosting this event with us and posing these questions for us. And thanks to Policy Exchange for putting on the event, and to the Palantir Foundation, who's helped sort of bring some of us together for this talk. I mean, I guess I would start with the fact that obviously U.S. policy right now deeply reflects President Trump's sort of view of the world and what he sees that he wants to focus on. And I think it's very clear, building on his first administration, that he views the international trading system as and the international sort of economic system as something that is in dire need of reform, a re-engineering of the global trading system. And in many ways, that is what he and his administration is focused on. China is a very large part of that challenge, but it's not the complete challenge, right? And so I think it's I've often stressed that it's important to sort of understand that the president's sort of worldview is not a sort of maybe a traditional foreign policy or national security worldview. It's a trade and economic worldview, and that then impacts the way in which he approaches these issues and then what he wants to be able to sort of do and accomplish. And I think it's clear that from the inauguration, right, January 20th, and the executive orders that he was putting out, that's where his focus was. And I think he in many ways views his counterparts in other countries as not fully aligned with him on what he's trying to achieve. And so, that means that China policy is not its own standalone thing. It's a subset of that broader trade and economic policy. And that's how I think we should interpret it. I think we can then discuss a variety of the specifics of how that unfolds, but unless you sort of internalize that trade and economic focus, it's really difficult to understand what he's trying to achieve.
Mike, I'm going to, as a heads up, I want to come back to aspects of US-China relations, including what I see as quite a wide set of potential outcomes in terms of those relations. Some people have talked about a Mar-a-Lago 2.0, et cetera, but pause that for now. I want to ask you quite a specific question on that alignment point. What is the message ahead of President Trump's state visit to the UK about alignment in certain geographic theaters? So there's a question over alignment, which I think we'll touch on, is technology, policy, export controls, and you'll see some of this, which are in whatever's agreed between the US and UK governments in terms of deeper technological sharing, et cetera, which will have a China component to it, explicit or implicit. But there's other messaging that's coming from the administration, as reported in the media, as to sort of UK involvement in other theaters. So one reported message from parts of DoD is get out of the Indo-Pacific. This is not a theater for you. The primary thing you can do to help the United States is amp up burden sharing in a European context. We have the backdrop to the AUKUS review currently going on at the Department of War, DoD. Which is people have raised questions about sort of likelihood of that. So all these were sort of part of that sort of broad alignment on the China policy. Are we just sort of sit and wait it out, or is there some very clear messaging in your interpretation coming from the top as to where the relative balance of effort should be?
I mean, I think anyone from the current administration would tell you that primarily listen to what the president says publicly of what he's looking for. And I think, at least for members of the G7, probably the most important thing that he's laid out in terms of alignment on China policy is, his recent announcement that, he desires other G7 members to impose, fairly hefty tariffs on those that are buying Russian oil and natural gas. And that he sees this as the way in which the United States and the other members of the G7 could put sufficient pressure on Putin to end his war in Ukraine. And he's made it very clear, right, that that's both China and India as the receivers of that, and that if they don't get that kind of cooperation across the G7, it'd be very difficult to see how we could get the kind of resolution that he'd like to see, which is an end to a conflict in Ukraine. And so that's what I would sort of take most seriously. Like you, I've seen those reports, from members of the department, expressing their desire or no excitement around involvement in the Indo-Pacific. But I haven't heard that necessarily from the president, and so, at least in my experience, that's where countries should be focused. and then less so at that sort of lower level. That's just how this administration, I think, works.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to Abigail in just 1 second. So that essentially means then take as the latest statement of US policy, not an ongoing review with a potentially open-ended outcome, but actually take the latest statement of US policy as the statement issued or the readout issued by Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer on the back of the finance ministers meeting, which focused on Russian oil and gas and then the China-India implications of that.
I mean, to me, Secretary Bessent and Jameson Greer are in the driver's seat for what the president is trying to achieve, right? And again, that's a little bit different than what we've been used to in other administrations, where the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor might be that front person for those things. I think we should understand that how President Trump has set up his administration is that primarily it looks to what has been colloquially called the trade team, right? That U.S. Trade Representative, the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, and the Director of the National Economic Council, right? Those are the folks who primarily are driving sort of U.S. foreign policy, largely through an economic and trade lens, not necessarily a national security lens.
That is very interesting in itself. Abigail, let me ask the same question to you from the perspective of Brussels, but just to note, as we were talking previously, the picture of sort of broad alignment, at least conceptually, that I painted in the back end of the Biden administration. Actually, you worked with Matt when Matt was in the first Trump administration. So there's a longer tail to that. There's a prehistory there. So where do you sort of take this question from a Brussels perspective?
Maybe the starting point is to start with the fact that you go around ministries at the moment across the different member states, and you hear transatlantic coordination on China is dead. And I think this is the starting point. So the arrival of the Trump administration, while I think all Europe was prepared for it, and there has been quite decent amount of work done in track 1.5, in track 2 ahead of that, still creating that shockwave. I'm part of the people that continue to argue that somehow transatlantic coordination is not going to be dead and cannot be dead. It's just a matter of time, it's a matter of sectors, but things have changed and there is a reset. So probably the good starting point is to ask ourselves, where are we in Europe? What has changed in Europe? Where are European interests? And then to look back at why do we need the US and what do we need them for? And we heard, I mean, the people that are now in the administration saying there is a scope, but it's going to be based on your own interests. So think about it first, and then let's basically join forces. So maybe it's just a matter of time. Where we are in Europe, and I think Matt laid out the ground, but in a very interesting way, saying national security somehow has moved up as a second priority. For us in Europe, this security dimension and the securitization of the debate in China is first. And this notion that China is challenging the security architecture of Europe, this is basically a new idea. And with that comes the question of who is best to answer that, because national security remains a member state prerogative, a member state's competence. At best, you deal with it in NATO, but Brussels, having this conversation in Brussels is a very difficult one. And then the second part of the conversation is the one on competitiveness, where here the China equation, which used to be one of we need China for our global competitiveness, we need the Chinese market, this is no longer there. And this creates a reverse mindset in capitals where you think in government, okay, we need to de-risk, and then you go to companies that do not have the same long-term perception saying, well, sorry to say, but I'm the BMW CEO, and as far as I'm concerned, I do still need China. So the link between competitiveness and work with company, in what Matt was explaining, this change in global trade fragmentation, this is key, and this is probably one of the missing points. So once I've told you that it's very difficult for Europeans to securitize the debate on China, once I've told you that on competitiveness, we have a very good assessment. You take the Letta report, you take the Draghi report, you look at the speeches of the Commission President, we know where we go. and hence, but then the answers are within companies and within citizens. And this is the last missing point for me, and this is the changing point. China is becoming in Europe a domestic question. And becoming a domestic question means that you then, as a government, have to respond to your citizens about job loss. And Macron was the first a few months ago to say, well, this is how many jobs are going to be lost due to China and due to the cognac question, for instance. And he was the first one to recognize the impact it's going to have. But who is going to be the leaders in Europe today that is going to say, well, I'm going to take a tough decision knowing that you may lose votes at the end of the day. And this is probably a dimension that is under looked at and under considered, but we are today in a moment where the paradigm as regard to the way we see China and the way we orient our China policy, we may have the right assessment, but the tool to answer it are very difficult to draw and are very have a political cost. And I think this question of how much political cost leaders in Europe are ready to pay at the moment to make the right decision on China for the future, that is 10 years' time, that's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, that's interesting. Neil, do you want to come in from a UK perspective? You've had various roles in government where China policy didn't actually fit in the conventional national security context, but China literacy in terms of long-term industrial strategy, technological policy, etc., is absolutely vital. So how do you assess where it's at now?
Yeah, so I've sort of, when I think about the UK, I'm struck by the complete absence of any domestic agreement or consensus on what to do about China, and that is true at a lot of levels. And I've kind of lived that myself, right? So I worked for George Osborne as a special advisor when we were doing a period of golden friendship. And I set up a China research group in 2020 at the period where we started to move into a phase where people were more critical of the CCP. And we now obviously have the new Starmer government, which is back to an attempt at a golden friendship. Very ad hoc and buffeted by events. So suddenly we need the Chinese to help us out with the steel mill here. We need such and such a thing. It's not particularly strategic approach that we have even under the current government. And so the only anchor at the moment in the system is the sort of Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office does have an institutional view, which is basically pro-golden friendship, pro-stock-up, and I think wrong. But they're the only ones with any kind of consistent view, and so we find ourselves back at the start of the kind of loop that we've gone round, which I find very, very depressing. And so we are a kind of ununited country within a deeply ununited Europe, facing some very difficult questions. I mean, I thought yesterday also was just, if you want to understand the full depths of the problem in this country, right? So I was in the chamber yesterday on the front bench to hear the minister explain, or as it happened, not explain, why the two men who spied on members of parliament, including me, are not going to be prosecuted. So last year, while we were still in government, the CPS put out a note explaining why this case was an open and shut, slam dunk case, and they listed 34 occasions on which these people had spied on members of parliament, and they'd actually done things proactively as well as requests from the CCP. And it's quite a bad thing to allow people to spy on your members of parliament and to subvert people within parliament. And we are not going to even manage to prosecute that. I mean, what signal does that send to you if you are Beijing that we are unserious? And of course, so we who are sanctioned, so I'm one of the many parliamentarians who's sanctioned, not able to go to China. They also seized my assets in China, which won't add greatly to Beijing's coffers, I can promise you. But we have written to the DPP saying, come on, give us an explanation. Why has this been dropped? And I think part of the explanation will be an unwillingness to have a clear strategy. The minister yesterday was tying himself in knots at the dispatch box to avoid using any word that might imply that China was, in some sense, an enemy. They were a challenge. They weren't even a threat. They were a challenge, a complex challenge on one occasion as he spoke. But a lack of clarity on this is hampering us in 1,000 different ways. And my primary interest, as you know, is, to go back to Matt, an economic one. The UK, while we should support and do whatever we can to help in terms of deterring aggression from the CCP on the other side of the world, and deterring diplomatic aggression elsewhere, which there's so much of. We should try and do those things. And yeah, we should continue to explain to the population of the UK why this is a bad regime. This is a regime with 1 million people in camps in the Uyghurs being sterilised on a huge scale to be ethnically replaced. You know, it's a bad regime armed with technologies of surveillance that the GDR could only have dreamed of, that give you the power to run social credit. It's a much more powerful, dangerous, sophisticated operation than any of the regimes of the old Eastern Europe. So we must continue to explain that. There's not a lot we can do about it internally. There's nothing we can do to get those people out of the prison camps in China at this stage. But the thing we can do is to at least defend ourselves economically. But we're not even doing that, right? So obviously we had a phase of staggering naivety in the 1990s where we thought that this was like adding Belgium. It was like, we'll bring you into the world trading system, we'll ask no questions. Change is inevitable within your country, so we'll just give you a completely free pass, which has lasted really to the present day. And the thing I've been trying to communicate, we've been trying to communicate, we who are more critical here, is it's just about the nature of the economic problem, which is dawning on people across Europe now, but why this is, orders of magnitude different from anything you faced before with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, or whatever. It's a completely different thing. I can expand on that, but you get the general direction.
Well, can I push you on precisely that point? Because having been in many of these discussions in my time in government, a first observation, just picking up where Abigail left off, is that it is unquestionably easier to adopt more robust measures vis your internal security, economic security, and some of your foreign policy positions if you do so in numbers and with broad alignment. And it is much more difficult to operate a clear and consistent policy, and clarity and consistency are not easy things to come by in government when, in trying to do that, the country you are following is, in polite terms, veering across the road. And there are a number of potential outcomes to its approach, from sort of accommodation through to unexpected sort of tension, friction, escalation. So that's just a practical challenge. But a more precise challenge, Neil, and I was always frustrated that we didn't seem to evolve from this position, was the dichotomy, as discussed in many rooms with ministers, officials, experts, otherwise, between an approach to the China question that emphasized national security equities, constantly set up against what you might call, in Whitehall parlance, the prosperity departments, and an approach to growth. And if the government's biggest strategic challenge is growth, as stated itself, that this balance between the two was really hard to deal with. Now, in different eras with different economic models, you could argue a different case. And maybe to put it even more sharply, that was actually quite particularly hard for a conservative government, more trained to believe in free markets, openness, inward-outward investment flows, etc. So how do you win the argument that you've put, and I've heard you make very eloquently, because it's one that I'm sympathetic to, but to reflect upon, it's one that you keep on slipping back from in many of these conversations.
Yeah. So. I put it like this. So in the 1990s, we thought we were building a kind of perfect world economy in which we would dismantle trade barriers and companies would be the players, governments would not be the players. The European Union in its sort of pomp was part of that. But China's not like that. How do you, if you are a pro-free market person in general, adapt to a world in which one of the two main superpowers in the world is not a market economy, really? It operates like a single entity with a single controlling
maybe two of the superpowers in the world.
No, quite. And it is an advantage, just to take that directly, it's an advantage for the US that they can appeal in a way that we've struggled to in Europe to the patriotism of the people running the biggest companies, right? Those tech firms, they're very clearly American companies, and they want to have good relationships with the President of the United States. And that's a tremendously powerful model, to the point that it was made as we go around Europe. Well, which country does Airbus belong to again? And like, why should they make trade-offs now that will, I think, be good for them, not being eaten by Comac tomorrow, but might be painful today? It is more difficult in Europe. And just to set out the model, because you asked me to look, why is China so different to what the Japanese did and Taiwanese and the South Koreans did with the policies that we perceived as unfair economic policies at the time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? It is partly just the scale of the thing itself. It's 1.4 billion people rather than 23 million people in Taiwan. it is partly that scale gives them the ability to operate the successful trap where they do forced technology transfer. You want to get to be part of that market, you have to come in, you have to do the JV, they extract all your technology, you create your own competitor, and before you know it, you're dead. But it's also a more powerful state in lots of other ways. You know, its security infrastructure and its diplomatic muscle are much greater. Its ability, also just through physical infrastructure and physical scales, to compete with us in all those other markets around the world. If you're building all the high-speed rail systems all across the rest of the world, right, you've got to kind of lock in on these things. And if, you know, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea were kind of American protectorates, essentially, and there were limits on what they could do to use their intelligence capacities to add to what their own companies were doing in terms of IP theft. Right? Not the case with China. So it is just a radically different thing, and we've just seen so many companies get chewed up. And so my argument to the economic side of British government has always been, this is a short, long thing, right? In the short term, you're all attracted by the prospect of this investment right now. You want to be their best friends right now. The problem is these guys want to kill you. They want to totally demolish your market. They want to have the market. You want to go and invest in there. They want to just take everything you've got, this competitive advantage. And then at the end of all these things, I've listed all the unfair things that they do, the IP theft, the forced technology transfer, and so on and so forth. The huge domestic subsidies, which are not ever reported to WTO, that we just let them get away with absurdly. But at the end of it, they then do some things which are totally fair game. They build a brilliant engineering state. They have the kind of innovation industrial complex I want us to have in this country. They have the alignment of particularly their defense universities with their industrial sectors. I think those are kind of legit policies. So the US does these things brilliantly. That they have, that is built on top of all these other things they used to get there. And then people get confused and say, well, isn't China, are they just competing fairly? They're just really good at all this stuff. And it's a mix of fair and unfair. That's why it's difficult to explain to people how you tackle it and why you've got to protect yourself against it.
Again, I'm sympathetic to that proposition. That's a pretty significant shift for the UK economic model, whether it be the sort of scions, big figures of the tech industry sitting around at the feet of President Trump, or a kind of UK version of state capitalist planning, which is what you're talking about.
I would go as far. We don't need to turn ourselves into a sort of state capitalist economy to just be a bit less naive about what's happening with IP and our own ability to try and create a bit of the future in the UK. So we've got to be careful about the language we use. But yeah, I think ultimately we'll get coshed over the head so many times that eventually people will get the message, right? There will just be so many sectors and individual companies where we just lose out, and we'll eventually get the message, I hope.
I would say from in defence of time in government, what we are is a bit less naive. I give us that mark. But the structural, others are shaking their heads who are also in government at the same time. So let me do a bit of a horizon scan, and you can answer this any which way you want. Mm-hmm. So an observation is our discussion thus far is quite internal, as per my prompt. So we're reflecting from different allied capitals, if we can still call them that, about sort of directions in China policy. We have now talked about China itself. And last year was this notion put out by Hal Brands, the scholar at the Kissinger Center, of peak China, that China reached a certain point. Earlier this year, there was a bit of excitement about the possible future of Xi Jinping being under challenge, which all seemed to settle down again as well. And then there's the whole question of Taiwan, where the focus, I think, in some respects has moved away from this 2027 scenario to concerns over lawfare, encroachment of Taiwanese customs, freedom of maneuver, etc., etc. So that's on the China ledger. But you could take this question another way, which is, to my mind, looking at the Trump administration, there's quite a degree of potential fork in the road as to long-term China policy. So at the moment, we're a 50% tariff. Yep. We're in a tentative negotiation led, as you say, by Scott Bess and Jameson Greer to find some sort of accommodation. Others have talked about, including those actually in the Trump administration, a Mar-a-Lago Accord Style 2. If you go really deep into the anxieties of other G7 capitals, lots of people worry about a G2, a sort of a massive accommodation balance of power between China and the US. So where are we likely to go, Matt? Is it going to be Trump administration continuity between the two terms, or is there a possibility for something that Europeans are unprepared for, which is a big dirty deal, which they have to adapt to on their own time.
Yeah, certainly there is. This is not the first time we've heard of the concept of a G2, right? I mean, this is, if we harken back to when I started doing China policy in the U.S., sort of the middle of the Obama administration, Xi Jinping brings forward new type great power relations as a term of art, and you get a lot of discussion around sort of a G2, that the United States and China would sort of divide up the world. The U.S. would get its sphere of influence, and it could set the rules for that. And Beijing would like to have its sphere of influence, and it sets the rules for that. And then the two great powers, through mutual respect, would interact with each other, right? This is sort of the concept that Xi Jinping presents to Barack Obama at Sunnylands in August of 2013. And of course, I think the Obama administration rightly was a bit aghast at this, right? They thought they were actually welcoming China into a broader international system in which China would play as a responsible stakeholder within an existing rules-based liberal international order. And then to hear Xi Jinping essentially lay out an entirely different concept was a bit like, fingernails on the chalkboard. But fast forward, now a dozen years, and so that idea is sort of still there. My sense is that certainly this idea of sort of a grand bargain is certainly on the table, but I've tried to try to think through what I think are, what are the U.S. demands for this grand bargain? And I'm going to start from kind of easy things that China could do, Xi Jinping could do, to very, very hard, if not impossible things, which I think are the sort of the 5 demands that the U.S., at least President Trump, has sort of levied on Xi Jinping to kind of get a deal. The first is sell TikTok to a U.S. owner, right? On the scale of hard to easy to do, a relatively easy thing for Xi Jinping to do, but apparently he does not want to do that. Stop supplying fentanyl precursors and stop laundering money for drug cartels. The president has been very clear about that. In fact, the Biden administration was quite clear about that as well. Number 3, no military attacks against Taiwan, the Philippines, and sort of other neighbors of China. Help the U.S. force Putin to end its war in Ukraine. And number 5, I think, in the nearly impossible to do camp, achieve balanced trade with the United States. Right? That's the list of asks, and I think those things are actually. I think they're nearly impossible for China to fulfill.
Even like 1 and 2?
1 and 2 potentially.
Like it should
1 and
be.
2 potentially.
I guess
But again, what I provided in terms of order of importance or order of easy to hard was also reverse order of importance, right? So when the president sort of thinks about this achieving balanced trade, let's be very honest with ourselves. I mean, you brought up the term peak China and the work by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley around this idea that sort of China is a peaking power. The Chinese government is known now since the 18th Party Congress, back when Xi Jinping came to power, that they needed to transition their economy away from a state investment-led, state-led to allowing the market to play a much more decisive role in the outcomes of the Chinese economy. And in the dozen years of Xi Jinping's rule, they have not done that, right? In fact, they've moved in the opposite direction. And so things that Chinese economists understood that the Chinese economy needed to do in order to sort of transition from this growing and infrastructure type economy that's going from a very low mark and very low per capita GDP and trying to move through the middle income trap, that they need to make some transitions to their own economy in order to make it to sort of the next stage of development. And we should be very honest with ourselves. The Chinese government has not done those things. In fact, they've started some of those reforms and then stopped them as soon as they started to disrupt social stability inside China. right? And so Xi Jinping appears to be unwilling to conduct the kinds of economic reforms that his own economists have laid out to them that they need to be able to do.
Isn't it a mix though? So
Yep.
I think that the reason they're sort of twofold. It's partly they disagree about what the next stage of economic development looks like, and they have a more status scientific, engineering-oriented version of that. And they're like, we're not going to let all of us best people
Yep.
produce cat memes. We're going to produce a thing that will wallop you in terms of technology. We will burn faster than AI and other things like that. And then there is a bit of it which is just like stuck in the mud. It's like we just got to keep pouring concrete. We're going to dump
Yep.
all of our surplus on Africa, all that kind of stuff, just because the momentum is there. So there's like
Yeah.
two.
There is, and so I think there is certainly a realization that unless and until your average Chinese citizen has more wealth to be able to buy things, right? You're not going to get a Chinese economy that can focus on sort of the growth and wealth of its own citizens, right? But to do that would mean that the state would have less control of over that capital, right? And so I think what we're watching is you have a certain set of senior Chinese officials. They portray themselves as engineers. I think that of them far more as ideologues, who have understood that they had an economic model that got them to where they are, and they're unwilling to abandon that model, because to abandon that model would mean that they essentially are giving up political power and handing that over to Chinese citizens, and that is the problem.
Can I ask you just a question from my knowledge? A few years back, there was a great push to put more party people into companies and to have that further control, and even than they did before. Is that all still like going on? Is that still very much in progress?
Very much so.
No.
Because I want to open up for questions in a moment. I'm going to come to Abigail. I've just got one little precise question for you, which is almost an inversion of the question I asked Neil. Is it the case that the economic interdependence and the interests of US capital, some big firms, CG, Nvidia, you could give others, have meant that because of those economic dependencies, intertwining of supply chains, etc., that the Trump administration has taken its foot off the gas with regard to some of the late Biden administration export control policies, and what do you make of that?
Yeah, first I want to make sure that we don't think about like business or capital as monolithic, right? We've got a variety of folks that have a whole, that sit across the spectrum of views on China. But yeah, obviously there are certain companies that do see that they have sort of staked their economic future on access to the China market, and sort of see that as very important. And they represent a certain set of voices. Those voices might be incredibly influential, but they don't represent, I think, the totality of companies that are in existence inside the United States. Just like they don't represent the totality of businesses across Europe or across the UK, right? So you get some very loud voices, and those voices might have some real influence, but they don't, I think we should be much broader about what it is and be more precise about who we're actually talking about, as opposed to all business thinks X. So that would be my first thing. And I think the other side of this is that from the president's perspective, I think he thinks there are a certain set of tools that are particularly good, and it's not a surprise that he believes that tariffs are a good and useful tool. And he is much more skeptical of the tool of export controls, right? I happen to be a much stronger proponent of a broader-based toolkit, and I think that export controls provide a very real benefit inside that toolkit. But I don't think that that's how the president views it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he is sort of abandoning his overall objective, which is to fundamentally change that economic system to be something that what he views as benefiting the United States far more, and to reduce the benefit of that system to the PRC. Right? That's the dynamic that I think is playing out here, and we'll see. I think certainly on the Nvidia side, I would say that the decisions on like the H20 chip, that is a chip that the Biden administration had not blocked. It was only blocked to China in April as we went through a series of escalations, in and around the global reciprocal tariffs, and then that thing has been pulled off. The other restrictions around other more advanced chips appear to still be in place, right? And so I think we should also contextualize what is the actual decisions that have been made, and it would suggest that there are still significant export controls, on advanced technology to China, and certainly Beijing would love to see those things pulled off, but they have not yet been pulled off.
Okay, Abigail, you had an eyebrow raised at various points, so please you come in and then, ladies and gentlemen, please prepare your questions. We'll open it up in a moment.
No, it's because basically the question of the H20 chips is the last conversation we had over the summer, where I was like, where is this coming from? And sorry, but no. But I think and this is related on the state of play of China at the moment and this discussion on economic development. I think we may underestimate as well how much the social contract in China has changed. And the social contract has changed because this idea that China would provide a technological-driven environment to its citizen is now one of the foundation of the new social contract in China, which means that they can endure much more pain, which means that the guys that are driving the economic agenda, which somehow for us do not make sense, actually, if you are in Beijing, it does make sense, because what you're offering to your citizen is what they want. And this is this question on the technological advancement and where China is at the moment. And in that sense, Matt is right in saying so far there are areas on high technology where we have maintained an edge in Europe and in the US vis-a-vis China, and this is something we are going to try to continue to do through export control and through the work that we are all doing on export control. I believe so, because this is what's going to remain for China one of the most difficult part, and something on which we have leverage over China. And this question of how much leverage do we have and how much of this leverage can we use, somehow the Americans are used to do that. We in Europe are learning that there are dependencies that we can use and that we can touch to basically make China do what we want. And to come back on the list of Matt, I think you would take the list and you would look at it in reverse order, which means that the war in Ukraine and China's support to Russia would be number one in what Europe wants, which makes it, in terms of transatlantic coordination on China, somehow difficult because we're not aligned on this. Then the second point is unfair trade practices. For you come fifth, and for us come second, and sometimes first. And this is something on which the Chinese are not going to give us anything. That's really clear, because it would touch their industrial model. And you said it's in a very blunt way. This is not something on which China is going to move. And then the third thing would be basically on national security, be out. And this is something on which the debate in Europe is not mature enough to have that presented to China in an articulated way that makes sense.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to take a bunch of questions. So Pulse Exchange house rules are no question too outrageous, but you have to state your name and organisation, and we can't possibly check whether you're making it up or not. There's a gentleman in the front row. I'm going to take a bunch of three. Gentleman in the front row, gentleman with his hand back there, and I'll go to gentleman in the front row here.
Thank you to the panel. Jonah Kaplan, geopolitics analyst at Sibylline. I've lived in China for many years. Mike Brzezinski in the 1990s in the Grand Chessboard said the one thing you want to avoid is strategic alignment between Russia and China. We'll see how that's gone. So is this, in light of this, is the West, the aim is to work together in order to take on the axis of Krink, or is the better objective to siphon off either China, Russia, or one of those countries for engagement? And if so, how do you perceive that going about? And
Hold thoughts for a moment. Gentleman back there.
Thank you. Sahil Shah, co-founder of Global Stability Network. Two questions. The first was, what tools of economic statecraft do you believe are unexplored? More so when it comes to the potential for deterrence as to punitive measures. And the second is the panel's thought on information campaigns, especially in light of the closure of the Global Engagement Center, and how information campaigns in China could potentially be used to constrain Chinese state behavior.
Brilliant. Now we'll go to Paddy in the front row.
Hi, I'm Paddy McGuinness. I'm a former UK Deputy National Security Advisor. And aren't you deluded in this sense that you list a set of things which we must stop, which we must prevent, don't do this, don't do that, have controls, when Xi Jinping actually has probably got his sphere of influence that he wanted in 2013 from Obama? And we see that because 7G is probably going to be Chinese, certainly outside Europe and the US, because if the UK wants to do offshore wind, it's going to have to use Chinese blade technology. It hasn't got its own, no one else can provide it. Because Spain is going to intercept its communication using Huawei, which we think you can't have in there. They did cancel it, but they were going there, weren't they? Yeah. So in a way, he's lapping at us, and we don't have a net estimate of where we are compared to where we were when Neil started all that work, or Matt started all that work. And without that, we can't create real urgency. So I'd really like you to kind of address your delusion.
Okay. We've gone from Brzezinski to economic tools of statecraft to self-delusion. Who'd like to go first?
So I'll go first. The other two would do much better than me on the other questions. But on this point about delusion, I have very modest ambitions here. I would like us to survive economically. That is what I think we're playing for. And I don't have any grand illusions about Britain's ability to deter China militarily. I don't think it is impossible for us to do some things to play ourselves into these industries of the future, to make sure that we at least have a decent slice of it, which is what we need to ensure. But that will not happen economically. And to your point about no naivety, the momentum is hugely against us in terms of this kind of scientific engineering commercial juggernaut that they have created, which is still moving, still very much moving forward. But you say there's no naivety. Well, there's also no naivety about our ability to brilliantly coordinate. But it would be good to try and get to first base on some of those things. And the point about President Trump wanting to put America first, not being his way of framing things, is not going to go away when he goes away as well. I think that's the natural inclination of the US, the biggest, most important, most coherent part of the West. But nonetheless, it must be possible to at least have some degree of coordination. Some of these questions about technology. Some of them are harder than others. We talked about some of the harder ones. There may be lower level ones. But starting to get to a first base on some of those things and a process to try and have a degree of cooperation about not just doing stupid things that allow them to cause us to slit each other's throats would be a very good start. So I think it's an excellent question. I'm glad to be able to clarify what I think we're really playing for here from my point of view.
Abigail?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think one we have all stumbled on. I think you are going to meet this sense of urgency in many places, and this question of what can be done and what is actually making sense. And if you look at the SEO summit images, then you realize that there is part of the battle that we have lost, right? We are today only 27% of the planet is living in a democracy. That's the reality. So that fight over the value-based approach that we somehow still did when we were together, this is gone. Right, and I agree, probably the battle is around how many jobs you're going to basically keep and how much of technological advancement you will be able to keep and how many of your companies are going to survive. And these are the three key questions that you should ask yourselves. In the European Union, and sorry, I'm going to leave the UK outside, we're also dealing with 27 different realities, and they are so difficult to comprehend. You look at Sweden, it's a place who went from I'm against FDI screening to I think it's a good idea. It's a place that today rank among the top 3 globally in having an unfavorable view on China, and yet you had Sweden very vocal against the tariffs on EVs. And you're like, I agree, Volvo is your biggest employer. Yes, you want the survival of Volvo for jobs related reasons, but isn't that the costs that you will have to pay and the pain that you will have to endure? And this reality, Sweden is just, it's a nutshell, but I can go into Hungary, I can go into France, and you have that in 27 member states. And the best that we have to do is actually place all our bets in Brussels and say FDI screening, from now on the Commission decides, and the member states are out. On national security, we don't like it, but basically on economic security, we give the hand to Brussels and Brussels decide. But if you look at governments around Europe, this is not going to be what's going to happen. And this is why this basically disentangling your economy from China, de-risking and partnering, it's a trilogy that has somehow not brought the results that were intended. And it's what Matt was saying at the beginning, we are in this moment of paradigm shift where we need to think differently, which means that in Brussels today, you have conversation on tit for tat against China. And tit for tat means that the moment we started to say we are going to investigate the BYD investment in Hungary ex officio on the basis of the fact that it's being subsidized, so using the foreign subsidies regulation ex officio, which means that any Chinese company in Europe could be looked at and the investment could be out on the ground that is one that has subsidies. You imagine how many companies we are talking about. The Chinese said, if you go that way, we are going to retaliate. And they have just announced the retaliation, which for now are limited, but this idea that from now on, every time Brussels make a move, China is going to respond, and the move from Brussels are going to be even more offensive. This is a changing of the mindset of the European Commission, which is a project based on this idea that you nicely laid out. We are going to trade, and globalization is fantastic and is going to work out, which is related to your question on economic statecraft. Right now, it's about being creative and it's about looking at the margins. And I had so many fights with him on the WTO and how much of our instruments would be WTO compatible, because this was the DNA of how Europe is trading. This was the reason to live in the European Commission at DigiTrade. This time is over. This is game over. We are going to the margin, I say to the margin, to the gray zone of the WTO, because this is our best chance. Is this going to do the job in avoiding job loss and making the companies remain competitive? No, and we wrote recently a report. We were looking at overcapacity, and we listed, and it was painful, and the recommendation part, I listed a number of sectors in which this is over for Europe. Companies can just shut down. And it's about what are the segments of your industry that you are going to save, because you still have a technological advantage, and you better have an industrial policy that is not German-like, but probably more French-like, and an industrial policy that has commonalities with the one in the US. And this is, to come back to your question on coordination on China, this question of joint industrial policy. I may have some reserves on which sector, and I may disagree deeply with Matt on the sectors, but there are some on which it's either we do it together, we are brutal about it, and we manage to save part of our economy, because the rest, game over. And this, for political leaders, it's a reality that is very difficult to accept.
Yep.
Matt,
I'll give you China, Russia.
the last word is for you, but
Yeah.
I want, as we're out of time, I want to add one to it,
Sure.
which is in the US and in China, there is a strong sense that there is a breakneck race for, let's call it primacy, in artificial intelligence. And it dominates so much of the strategic conversation. It's the lens through which people look at the Taiwan challenge as well. Does America really give a damn in the midst of this race for primacy with China what Europe's doing anyway? That seems almost Trump 1 administration, almost Biden administration, as its focus, rigor, the detail at which it pores over European Union export controls just kind of out the window because it's got other bigger fish to fry in its own mind.
So first on China-Russia, obviously from a grand strategic level, it's a bad day when Moscow and Beijing align, and then it becomes sort of in terms of the long game, how do you ensure that they either cannot work together particularly well, right? They can't be effective, or that you find a way to pull one away from the other. And the logical way to do that is to pick that you pursue the weaker power as the one you pull away, right? There's a logic to that. I think we could all kind of get that. I say that from a general sense. Obviously, the specifics of how you would do that are actually quite difficult with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, right? They see eye to eye and share an awful lot of worldview, and they also have seen this movie before and understand what we would all be trying to do, right? So they get this. But again, to sort of connect to Patty's comment, I think we should understand that this is not a game in which we are, and I'm going to use an American football reference. We're not in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter, right? And the buzzer's about to go, and we're down by 20 points. This is an ongoing, right? There is not a buzzer that is we've lost, right? Every morning we're going to get back up again and have to deal with these same problems, have to manage these same problems again, right? There are strategies around being fast followers, right, in technology, which can be quite effective, right? So it is not clear to me that we should be depressed that we have lost or we're about to lose, right? Like, again, we have to deal with these things every day. We're going to have to come up with new tools in the economic statecraft toolkit. We're going to have to communicate more effectively. And that's just the reality of it, right? Like it isn't as if we're all going to go away tomorrow because we lost, right? We're just going to have to continue to deal with these problems. And that means we just have to get kind of serious about it, right? Which gets us back to, like, what do we actually have to focus on? It's that. Now, AI, I think that's certainly a big part of the discussion today. It's not clear to me yet that it is so overwhelming as to wipe out the rest of those considerations. But it's likely to have a big impact on both our economic prosperity and our national security, right? So therefore, it's an extremely important thing to be able to be focused on. And I think in that discussion, it's tough to see how Europe or the UK is a significant player in that, right? Like, in many ways, the U.S. has some advantages and China has some advantages that forces the U.S. to really have to overwhelmingly look at what China is doing in the AI field. And it would be different if there was a significant leadership in other places, but that just isn't the case right now. And it might develop into the future, right? Those things might we might see the Gulf states become significant AI powers, which then we have to calculate how we're going to play into that. But right now, that's not, at least in the next 6 months, is probably not on the horizon.
Okay, that's pretty stark message. I'm glad you didn't use a real football analogy. Because I, at the end, felt like the Manchester United fan I am, and another punch in the guts. Thank you very much. That was a very high quality discussion, given the range we covered, and we could go on for a number of hours. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.